So, thank you very much for waiting. Now we have come to the final aspect of our conference today. And by here, based on our 3I principle, we seek to intervene, first of all, by building the good base of understanding of Africa. And through that, we develop projects that are aimed at really securing the advancement of Africa in our lifetime. So we are doing this to share really knowledge, because we believe that without a proper foundation of knowledge, we cannot just step into a people or a place and begin to do anything that would be so beneficial. So we have been taking a series since last month called Shapers of Africa. Today is the second part. Last month we learned about the life and impact and the lessons from Muhammad Ali Pasha. But today we have another great phenomenon in Africa to talk about. And his name is Emperor Haile Selassie. This man is the last emperor of Abyssinia, or what became known as Ethiopia. And he was a very interesting figure, and his impact is still there till today. And we are going to take time to understand his life, what he did, positives, negatives, the challenges, and also come down with some lessons that we can learn from his life. Now, setting the scene. The Queen of Sheba came to see King Solomon, as was given or explained in the Bible in 1 Kings, if you read chapter 10, verse 1 to 13. It is believed that the Queen of Sheba came from that region in present-day Ethiopia, and he came to visit King Solomon to learn of his wisdom and to know of him. It is believed that Solomon and the queen actually knew each other sexually, and they had a child who became known as Menelik, and therefore Menelik the First. Menelik is said to have returned with the queen back to the ancient Abyssinia, and he became a king following his mother's passing. So, Haile Selassie is actually seen as a defining figure in modern Ethiopian history because of this Solomonic dynasty, this kingship that came from the said relationship between King Solomon and Queen of Sheba, following on with Menelik, is said to have come down to the time of Haile Selassie. And as he traces his roots to the lineage of the Emperor Menelik I, as I said, Haile Selassie was thus able to ascend to the imperial throne through his paternal grandmother, who is called Wozero Tegnawok Haile Selassie, who was an aunt of Emperor Menelik II and daughter of Negus or King Haile Selassie of Shewa. As much as Haile Selassie claimed direct descent from Makeda, the Queen of Sheba, and King Solomon of ancient time. This is a very important setting to the life and background of Haile Selassie. Now, moving on. Sorry for the noise. Moving on. What is the beginning of this man who is supposed to have such great lineage. So on the 23rd of July 1892, a child was born. And this child who was born is primarily called Lish Tefari Mekonnen Wodemikaya. That is the original name of the child that was born. Lish Tefari Mekonnen Wodemikaya in 23rd July 1892. Where was he born? He was born in Ejesa Goro in the Harar province of Ethiopia. And the Harar province, I believe, is still there today. It is actually the Muslim part of Ethiopia, or traditionally the Muslims conquered the people and had been there for many years. So he was born within the Muslim region at that time. And he was born by, or his mother was Wazero, or in English, Lady Yeshimebat Ali Abba Jifar, who was also the daughter of the renowned Omoro ruler of the Wolo province, Dejajmak, Ali Abba Jifar, and was said to be her 10th and last child. His father was called Ras Makonnen Wodemikaya Gudesa. And the reason he was born in Hara was because his father was actually the governor of Hara. And this governor is not necessarily modern day democratic appointment governorship. It means that he was a royal and his throne was to oversee Hara. Like in current days, the current princes, they say you are Duchess of Cambridge, you are Prince of Wales, stuff like this. Now, Ras Makonnen, or the father of this young man who is Emperor Selassie, served as a general in the first Italo-Ethiopia War, playing a key role in that battle at Adwa. He too was paternally Omoro and maternally Amhara. And this is very important if you know the Ethiopia region. Currently, I think the Omoros are necessarily not the biggest group, and they are even having some agitations with the government currently. And so the tribal situation in Ethiopia has always been very important, even to the extent that at the time of Haile Selassie's emperorship, he couldn't speak many of the languages of some of his people. So he always needed an interpreter and all. So it's a very broad region of different people, not one set of people we are talking about. But his tribe ruled the rest, even though they were not of the same tribe. Now, let's move on to what actually influenced this young man, or what inspired him. We talked about his Solomonic roots. Lish Tefari, or the one who later became known as Haile Selassie, actually understood his Solomonic roots. And as we go on, we realize that it actually influenced a lot of his thinking and behavior. And this cannot be separated from his experience and the way he lived his life. Also, his father played a very important role in his life, even though the father died at a young age, I think between 13 and 14 years old. Now, at the age of 13, it is said that on the 1st of November 1905, Tefari, or Lish Tefari, was led by his father to see a monk named Dejajmach, literally known as, to see a monk. And this monk actually named him Dejajmach, which literally means commander of the gate. Or you can also call, in modern chieftaincy or kingship terms, count. Now, Rastafari father actually arranged for him, as well as his first cousin named Imru, Haile Selassie, to receive instruction in Hara, where he was born, where the father was a governor, from a man known as Abba Samuel Wode Canaan, Abba Samuel Wode Canaan, who was an Ethiopian Capuchin monk. Now, and also from one doctor called Dr. Vitalian, a surgeon from Guadalupe. And these people actually taught Rastafari or Haile Selassie and brought him to some kind of mental or mentality that would lead and follow him through his life and direct his way of living. Shortly thereafter, his father, Ras Makonnen, died in Kulibi in actually 1906. Now, another thing that influenced or impacted his upbringing or his life was his exposure abroad. And we can see a few examples here. In 1924, Rastafari toured Europe and the Middle East with Jerusalem, and he also went to Alexandria. He went to Paris, Brussels, Amsterdam, Stockholm, London, Geneva, and Athens on this one single trip. The primary goal of the trip to Europe was for Ethiopia to gain access to the sea. Actually, in Paris, Tafari was to find out that the French foreign ministry would not really support him in this goal. However, though he failed in this, he continued and with his retinue, inspected some schools, some hospitals, some factories, and some churches. And although, he didn't get what he wanted, this experience and the inspections he did actually motivated him to really seek the European model of development for his own people. And we would see this come up in subsequent years. In this period also, the crown prince actually visited the Armenian monastery, because at that time he was a crown prince in 1924, in Jerusalem, of Jerusalem actually. There he adopted 40 Armenian orphans, and he had who had actually lost their parents in the Ottoman massacres. Tafari arranged for the musical education of the youth, and they came to form the Imperial Brass Band of Ethiopia. Now, we know that he also went to Jerusalem, or exiled to Jerusalem, later moved to Britain for a season. He visited Mexico, and he met with the Japanese prince Akihito in 1955. And on 13 December 1960, Selassie also was on a state visit to Brazil. Also in 1967, he visited Montreal. He went to the US a couple of times. The man became so well traveled, and all of these would come up to shape his mentality and change him over time. Not just to be a man of strong roots towards his people, but become more or less a global man. But we'll talk about that more in detail. He also believed in Christ, and his belief actually impacted him significantly. For instance, it is said that on 31st of March 1936, during yet the second attack, we talked about the first attack of Italy during his father's time as governor in Hara. Now, Italy attacked Ethiopia again in his time. And this is where we talked about in the previous session that things that happen in the past have generational impact. It is not just ordinary, that they get attacked by the same people only when he and his father are in rulership of the people. Now, on 31st March 1936, During this second attack by Italy, he actually launched a counterattack and against the Italians, but at the Battle of the Maichu in southern Tigray, the Italians really pressed the emperor and his people that they were losing out, or they lost out at that battle. So when the struggle to resist the Italy appeared totally unachievable for Emperor Selassie, he traveled to a rock-hewn church of Lalibela, and there he fasted and prayed, believing, putting his faith to practice. Actually, it is from this trip that it is said that you can say that his life got spared, because we will explore this afterwards, that from this trip, after the prayers, he came back and there was a decision that eventually helped him to spare his life at that time in Ethiopia. We'll talk about the details. Now let's get into the rulership, and then we'll get to some of these details. So these are the 4 key points that impacted the man. And as we talk about these lectures, it's an encouragement for everybody to understand what are those things that influence them, what are the roots, what are the experiences that should come together to make us who we are and to bring the impact that we desire. So this is the reason why we go through this. Now, his reign or his rule. In 1906, Tefari or Haile Tefari assumed the tutelage governorship of Selale, a realm of more or less marginal importance, but one that will enable him to continue with his studies. So he was given a governorship title per se at that young age, and he didn't need to do much, but then he was recognized indeed as a royal with a potential for the future, I would say. In 1907, a year after, very quickly he was appointed governor over parts of that province of Sidamo. Now, in 1910, which became pivotal year in Tefari's life, as we'll see, he became the governor of Hara. Hara, again, is where his father began from. That is where his father actually became a governor. Now, he took up that position in 1910. 7 years later, in 1917, Haile Tefari was elevated to Ras. And this is very important. Ras is a title in Ethiopian culture, or in their language, Amharic. It is a title, and it means crown prince. So the Ras was given to him as a crown prince in 1917, and it shows that he is one that is for the throne, more or less. Now, fast forward another 11 years later, on 7th of October 1928, 1928, he became king of Ethiopia, more or less emperor. But there is a little bit story behind this. The crowning of Tefari as king became very controversial, as I said. He occupied the same territory at this time as the empress, because at that time the queen, there was a queen. When he became a Ras or a crown prince in 1917, as you see, there was a queen on the throne, and her name was Queen Zewditu, and he was only supposed to work with the prince. But at this time, when he became the crown prince, the queen was there, and rather than going off to original so we'll say that in 1928, when he became given the title as a king, the Queen Zewditu had not been removed. So he was a crown prince when the queen was installed or crowned as a queen, Zewditu, and he was working with the queen. But 11 years later, some things happened, and he had to be given the title of king, or Negus. while at the same time, the queen, Zewditu, was still there. Now, what happened? Therefore, two monarchs, even with one being a vassal, or more or less, that we know that the queen is at a higher rank than the king, and had never happened in the same location in the Ethiopian history before. Now, conservatives at this time agitated to redress this perceived insult to the dignity of the crown. This led to the rebellion of Ras Gushka or Guksa Wele. Guksa Wele was the husband of the empress or the queen at that time, Queen Zewditu, and then the Shom of Beganda province, more or less a leader of that province. In early 1930, this Ras Guksa or Crown Prince Guksa, who is the husband of the empress or the queen, actually raised an army and marched it from his governorate to Gondar towards Addis Ababa. On 31st of March 1930, Guksa Wele was met by a force loyal to Negus Tafari. Now, Rastafari has become Negus Tafari as in Haile Selassie. And the troops that are loyal to him actually defeated Guksa at the Battle of Asham. Guksa was killed in action. News got to Addis Ababa. But when the news had fully reached Addis Ababa, it was reported that the Empress Zewditu was dead. Of course, there are rumors around this, and although it is rumored that the Empress was poisoned upon the defeat of the husband, or alternatively that she died from shock of hearing of the husband's death, the official message that was given and is being documented to today was that the queen or the empress Zewditu succumbed to a flu-like fever and complications from diabetes thereof. So this was the official reasons, but nobody could tell really how the empress was eventually removed for the king Haile Selassie to take over fully. Now, with the passing of Zewditu, Tefari or Rastafari himself rose to emperor and was proclaimed Negus Negast, meaning King of Kings of Ethiopia. He was crowned on 2nd November 1930. 1930. That is when he was crowned, actually, at Addis Ababa, Cathedral of St. George. The coronation was by all accounts a most splendid affair. In fact, it is said that he delayed the coronation for a couple of months, about 9 months, just to prepare so it will be, a great renowned event globally. Now, attendants at his coronation include the Duke of Gloucester, King George of United Kingdom's son, Marshal Francois d'Esprit of France, the Prince of Udine, or Udine, yeah, representing King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy, emissaries from the United States, Egypt, Turkey, Sweden, Belgium, and Japan were all present at the event. It is actually said that, or the British author Evelyn Waugh, who also shot the only known film footage of the event, actually was also, of course, there. One newspaper reported suggesting that the celebration may have incurred a cost of in excess of $3 million at that time. $3 million. Many of those in attendance received lavish gifts, and some of them were actually said to be gold made. In one instance, a Christian emperor even sent a gold encast Bible to an American bishop who had not even attended the coronation, but who was dedicated, who actually had dedicated a prayer to the emperor on the day of the coronation. So such was the flamboyance of his coming to power that he was so keen for global relevance. But eventually in 1975, about 45 years or 47 good years since he was named king, or 45 years he was enthroned to the emperorship, he would leave off in the most dramatic scene. Now let us talk about his impact. His impact. Economically, Haile Selassie is said to have really shaped up most part of the Ethiopia country. But it wasn't been that easy for him. So during his rule, even as regent, the new crown prince at that time he developed a policy of cautious modernization which had actually been initiated by Menelik II. But he took that project up and he tried to modernize the country yet again. Now, although patterning many reforms after European models, Tefari remained wary of European pressure. To guard against economic imperialism, Tefari, at that time, before he became even an emperor, required that all enterprises have at least a partial local ownership of his modernization campaign. And he remarked, in quotes, "We need European progress only because we are surrounded by it." That is at once a benefit and a misfortune. So he tried to balance the influence of foreigners into the economy of his country, but he tried to also bring them in. In 1942, he attempted to institute a progressive tax scheme, but this failed due to opposition from the nobility, and only a flat tax was paid. In 1951, he agreed to reduce this as well. Ethiopia was still semi-feudal anyway, and the emperor's attempt to alter its socio-economic form by reforming its models of taxation met with serious resistance from all manner of people, including nobility or clergy. And he was eager to resume his privileges even in the post-war era. So Haile Selassie actually succeeded in effecting new land taxes despite the opposition, but the burdens were often still passed on to the landowners, to the peasants. So the very poor of society had to bear it, because the people who pay the tax always passed it on to the peasant farmers at that time. It is also important to mention that economically it was at this time that he brought out or he helped to develop the Ethiopia Airlines, which is one of the best airlines in Africa today. And Haile Selassie, with the help of foreigners, started this. They built several bridges and dams. I think perhaps the first dam in Ethiopia was built in his time, and he tried to modernize the country, especially after the Second Italian War. Now, education-wise, he imported 2 printing presses and undertook the publication of Amharic books and tracts. It shows you the mentality of the man. He tried to get his people enlightened, and enlightened in their own language. After his return from Ethiopia from exile, after the Second Italian invasion of Ethiopia, he donated his fair warehouse in the UK, which he used to stay in, to the city of Bath, and as a residence for the aged. But recently, since 1990, that has been used for a daycare center. His own contribution again to education. Politics-wise, there has been major impact, and major beyond, I guess, every other realm for Haile Selassie. Selassie introduced Ethiopia's first written constitution on 16 July 1931, providing for a bicameral legislature where they form a legislature, but the legislature reported to the crown prince or the emperor. But he tried to build up that in the constitution, and in the constitution he made the crown prince or the kingdom chieftaincy a core part of the constitution of the people. This later on became a challenge to his rule. Also politically, in 1941, he crossed the border between Sudan and Ethiopia near the village of Idla. The standard of the Lion of Judah was raised again at this time for him. 2 days later, he and the force of Ethiopian patriots joined Gideon Force, which was one of the British forces fighting the Italians. Gideon Force, no, at this time, not the one fighting the Italians, but the local force to capture the city. Was already in Ethiopia, but he joined them and they prepared the way. Yes, of course, Italy was defeated at this time by a force from the UK and the Commonwealth nations, and they were free. They freed the Ethiopians. So politically, he played a big role. In 1948, the Ogaden, in the Ogaden region, which is a disputed region between Italian Somaliland and British Somaliland, was also granted to Ethiopia, expanding the political environment of the nation Ethiopia at that time. During the celebration of his Silver Jubilee in 1955, Haile Selassie introduced a revised constitution whereby he retained effective power while extending political participation to the people by allowing the lower house of parliament to become an elected body. So gradually he was giving up power and he was flexible in this term, but obviously ultimate power resided with him and the monarchy. Party politics were not provided for. That was not supposed to be the case. Modern educational methods were more widely spread throughout the empire, and the country embarked on a development scheme and plans to modernize the nation. Now, it is also important to talk about other aspects like religion, because between 1941 and 1959, Haile Selassie actually worked to establish the autocephaly of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. In a nutshell, he wanted to have a bishopric that was independent on its own. And I think he had challenges. The Pope would not necessarily permit them to be independent, but at least Pope Kyrillos the Sixth elevated the Abuna, or the leader of the Ethiopian church, to a patriarch at that time. So in traditional Orthodox Christian worship, they had a major center, and he actually was a major believer of Christ, and he wanted the church to rule the nation absolutely. And this brought him challenges. For instance, in 1948, the Harari Muslims of Harar, where he was a governor, where his father was a governor, they actually peacefully protested against religious oppression. However, the state responded violently. Hundreds were arrested, and the entire town of Harar was put under house arrest. And this kind of tensions would always simmer on to challenge him in the future. International stage-wise, he was a phenomenon. In keeping with the principles of collective security that he had, for instance, Haile Selassie sent a contingent under General Molugweta Buli to take part in the Korean War, and through the support of the United Nations Command. Also, he maintained cordial relationship with the government of UK through charitable gestures. And he sent aid to the British government in 1947 when Britain was affected by heavy floods. You know, that was such his thinking that even despite the poverty he and his people were in, when Europe had issues, he sent help. In modern days, many African leaders have come to that poor mentality to the extent that they don't even try to help anybody else. And that is not helpful, and that doesn't bring about advancement. But he did this in 1947, and this was what he wrote in his letter to Lord Mook, National Distress Fund London. He said, even though we are busy of helping our people who didn't recover from the crisis of the war, as in the Italian invasion war, we heard that your fertile and beautiful country is devastated by the unusually heavy rain and your request for aid. Therefore, we are sending small amount of money, about £1,000, through our embassy to show our sympathy and cooperation. This is how the man Haile Selassie lived. He gave despite his challenges. Giving has nothing to do with whether you have enough or not. Almost nobody has enough in this world. So, now again internationally, in September 1961, Haile Selassie attended a conference of heads of governments of the non-allied countries in Belgrade, in those times Yugoslavia. This is considered to be the founding conference of the non-allied movement. And Haile Selassie was there virtually as the leading African, hoisting the flag of African lineage. On 25th November 1963, he was also among the heads of state, including French President Charles de Gaulle, who traveled to Washington, D.C. and attended the funeral of the assassinated President John F. Kennedy. 1967, he visited Montreal, Canada to open the Ethiopia Pavilion at the Expo 67 World's Affair, where he received great acclaim, among others, world leaders there for the occasion. Now, also in Africa, he had such tremendous impact. He became the first chairman of the OAU, or the African Organization of African Unity. And not just the first, but again the fifth chairman. And he contributed to the establishment of the Organization of African Union, and that's why it's still present day held in Addis Ababa, because of Haile Selassie. He contributed Ethiopian troops to the United Nations operation in the Congo peacekeeping force during the 1960 Congo crisis. The emperor continued to be a staunch ally of the West while pursuing a firm policy of decolonization in Africa, which was still largely under European colony. So he tried to position himself well, not to be at war with the Europeans, but to foster decolonization of Africa. He helped successfully renegotiate the Bamako Accords, which brought an end to the border conflict between Morocco and Algeria. Haile Selassie in 1964 would initiate the concept of United States of Africa. This is the proposition later on was taken up by Muammar al-Gaddafi. And some Africans are still having this kind of thought, United States of Africa. But in modern times, it began by Haile Selassie rooting for this. Now, what are some of the challenges that Haile Selassie had? Now we talk about, first of all, his challenges, and then later on we talk about the negatives that also came from him. Early on in 1918, a great flu attacked the Abyssinia region, or present-day Ethiopia, and it really ravaged the cities and killed a lot of people, but he survived the pandemic. Tafari had his authority challenged early in his rulership, right from the time of governor to Ras to emperor. And for instance, in 1928, when Dejesmak, which is a name given to him, also the name given to him by the monk, but this time another person, Dejesmak Balka Safo, went to Addis Ababa with a sizable armed force to bring down Tefari from his rulership in Sadamo province. And we realize that during all these encounters, Tafari did not lose grip of the battle, that the armies came to remove him. His troops fought, and he sustained his rulership. And on 18 February, while Baka Safo and his personal bodyguard were in Addis Ababa, Tafari had Raskasa Haile Dage buy off his army and arranged to have him displayed as the Shom of Sidamo province by Buru Wode Gabriel, who himself was replaced by another man, Desta Damtel. So even so, the gesture of Bako Safo empowered the Empress Zewditu politically. At that time, she attempted to have Tafari tried for treason. So this is the season where Tafari has been named king or Negus, but then there was a queen or empress there. Now this guy also fought him, and the queen actually thought that it's a good time that now this guy challenging her rulership can be taken off. That is Haile Selassie. He was tried for his benevolent dealings with Italy, including a 20-year-old peace accord, which was signed on 2nd August. In September that same year, a group of palace reactionaries, including some courtiers of the empress, made a final bid to get rid of Tefari. The attempted coup d'etat was tragic in its origin and even very funny or comic at the end of the whole situation. What happened? When confronted by Tefari and the company of his troops, the ringleaders of the cult actually took refuge on the palace grounds in Menelik's mausoleum. Tefari, or Haile Selassie, and his men surrounded them, only to be surrounded again by themselves by his personal guard of Zewditu. More of Tafari's khaki-clad soldiers also arrived. So Tafari goes to challenge the army of this Ras guy. Then Zewditu's troops come in, surround Tefari, and then now more of Tefari's people come and surround them. So like 4 layers, different batches of military armed people all gathered in this strange conflict. At the end of the day, more of Tafari's troops came. They had superior arms, and they decided, decided actually the outcome in his favor. So popular support as well as the support of the police remained with Tafari at this time. Ultimately, the empress relented, and on 7th October 1928, she crowned Tefari as Negus, or king. So this is what led to him becoming crowned as a king. Somebody wanted to remove him as a Ras, and then the battles made him even stronger. The people were endeared to him. Actually, there was also another coup attempt in December of 1960. This time towards deep into his rulership as emperor. Whilst he was on a visit to Brazil, his own Kebu Sabagna, or Imperial Guard forces, actually staged an unsuccessful coup, briefly proclaiming Haile Selassie's eldest son, Asfa Wosen, as emperor. Now, the coup d'etat was crushed by the regular army and the police force. So, he had massive challenges, and he managed to be able to actually overcome most of these coup attempts. Now, you cannot talk about Haile Selassie without the intervention of the Italians in his time of rulership. Benito Mussolini, who is the fascist regime leader, was actually keen to avenge the military defeat of Italy that they had suffered in the first Italo-Abyssinian War. That time when Haile Selassie's father was a governor, the Ethiopians defeated the Italians very, very badly. Now, Mussolini came to power, and he wanted to go back and win the Ethiopia for himself. And he invaded, therefore, in 1935, he invaded Ethiopia. And following that, that invasion of Ethiopia at Ogaden province, Haile Selassie joined his northern armies and set up headquarters in Desa in Wollo province. He issued his mobilization order on 3rd October 1935. Compared to the Ethiopians, the Italians had an advanced and modern military which included a large air force, and therefore the Italians would come to employ all their chemical weapons and all this to come or bring down the Ethiopians. On 5th March, Marshal Pietro Badoglio led the Italian troops into Addis Ababa, and Mussolini declared Ethiopia an Italian province. And Victor Emmanuel III was proclaimed as the new emperor of Ethiopia. Very sad story. Now, that is not the only thing they did to capture the people, but also his daughter Teshaya died during childbirth shortly after restoration of the land in 1942 to Ethiopia. He also suffered many personal tragedies. The daughter, Princess Romanewek, wife of Desemark Bayon Miedri, was herself taken into captivity with her children, and she died in Italy in 1941. Another thing worth noting is the kind of challenges he himself is said to have brought to the people or has been involved in. So there was a king at that time called Iyasu, very early on, before 1913, or before Empress Zewditu came to throne. Now, Iyasu was the designate, but was not crowned emperor of Ethiopia, but more or less in charge in 1913 to 1916. Iyasu's reputation for scandalous behavior and disrespectful attitude towards the nobles at the court of his grandfather Menelik II damaged his reputation. And he actually is said to have flirted with Islam. And at the end of the day, in 1916, Tafari, together with others, other troop members, actually orchestrated the removal of Iyasu or Lish Iyasu from the emperor, and then they installed or crowned Empress Zewditu as the empress. And that was part of his contribution to oust a leader. Unfortunately, he would have a similar experience later on. Now, slavery was also a difficult challenge for him because he secured Ethiopia's admission to the League of Nations in 1923. And when he did this, he promised to eradicate slavery. But as of 1942, it is said that before 1942, up until then, slavery continued, and an estimated 2 million slaves in Ethiopia had been sent out alone. Up until 1942, 27th August, where Selassie confirmed the legal basis for the abolition of slavery that had been enacted by Italy throughout the empire and imposed several penalties, including death for slave trading. Again, his human rights record was a challenge, and civil liberties, political rights were low, with freedoms, houses giving Ethiopia a not free score for both civil liberties and political rights in the last years of Selassie's rule. Especially, there was said to be challenges oppressions on Muslims, and then the people of Eritrea or some of the villages in Eritrea were not allowed some freedoms. Farming also became a challenge for him in the Wollo northeastern Ethiopia, which is part of the Horn of Africa, which keeps coming up to today. Famine happened again in this region, and estimated that 40 to 80,000 people between 1972 and 1974 were actually killed through famine. And BBC reports cited a 1973 estimate of actually around 200,000. All this drawing massive influx of aid, while at the same time destabilizing Selassie's rule. Also, he was hit with oil crisis in 1973, and they couldn't manage with the farming situation at that time because of the oil crisis that hit the world. It worsened the situation. Now, let us move on quickly to a very important part of his life, the Rastafari movement. So this innocent emperor, who was not the first since Solomon, till today is worshipped as a God incarnate among some followers of the Rastafari movement. But it's important to understand that the movement, the name is just coming from his name that was given him when he was a crown prince. Ras meaning the crown prince or the duke, for instance, in equivalence to the UK sense. And Tefari was his name, actually. So they put it together and they say Rastafari, which is basically his name. And there's no mistakes about that. So Rastafari is coming from the name he had. And they created a movement, meaning head, or the title, as I said, a duke. And this actually emerged in Jamaica during the 1930s under the influence of one man called Leonard Howell. And he was a follower actually of Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was one of the American civil rights activists, and actually he criticized Haile Selassie strongly for the time of the war with the Italians. Now, Haile Selassie is viewed by these people as the Messiah who will lead the people of Africa and the African diaspora to freedom. And therefore, his official title given him include Conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah and the King of Kings of Ethiopia and the elect of God. And his traditional lineage is thought to be from the Solomon Sheba root, as I've said several times. These notions are perceived by the Rastafaris as confirmation of the return of the Messiah in the prophetic book of Revelations in the New Testament. King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah, and the root of David. So they put all these things together and they feel that this man is therefore the returned Jesus Christ. Rastafari faith is the incarnate divinity of Haile Selassie. Actually began after news reports of his coronation reached Jamaica, particularly via the two Time magazine articles of the coronation the week before and the week after the event. Haile Selassie's own perspectives permeate the philosophy of the movement, actually. Haile Selassie visited Jamaica on 21st April 1966, a very, very important day for the Rastafaris. And approximately 100,000 Rastafaris from all over Jamaica descended on Polisados Airport in Kingston, Jamaica, having heard that the man whom they considered to be their Messiah was coming to visit them. Spliffs and chalices were openly smoked, causing a haze of ganja smoke to drift through the air. And you ask yourself, what has this smoking got to do with your Lord reincarnate? But the whole airport was full of smoke because they openly smoked despite the laws at that time. He reportedly told them, Selassie is reported to have told them that they should not immigrate to Ethiopia until they had first liberated the people of Jamaica. This dictum came to be known as liberation before repatriation. Rita Marley, Bob Marley's wife, converted to Rastafari faith after seeing Haile Selassie on his Jamaica trip in 1966. She was also influential in the conversion of Bob Marley, who then became internationally recognized. So it was Rita Marley that actually influenced her husband Bob to become a Rastafari. And these two would make the Rastafari movement a global name like never heard before. She was also influential in the conversion, as I said, and therefore in a 1967 recorded interview with the CBC, Haile Selassie appeared to deny his alleged divinity. In the interview, Bill McNeil says, "There are millions of Christians throughout the world, Your Royal Majesty, who regard you as a reincarnate of Jesus Christ." Then Selassie replied in his native language, but essentially saying, "I have heard of that idea. I also met Rastafarians. I told them clearly that I am a man, that I am mortal, and that I will be replaced by the oncoming generation, and that they should never make a mistake in assuming or pretending that a human being is emanated from a deity." For many Rastafari, the CBC interview is not interpreted as a denial of his divinity. And according to Robert L. Hood, Haile Selassie neither denied nor affirmed his divinity either way. In 1948, Haile Selassie donated a piece of land at Shashamane, 250 kilometers south of Addis Ababa, for the use of people of the African descent from the West Indies. Numerous Rastafari families settled there and still live as a community till this day. So this is how the man has been made a deity for some people. Now, before we get to his final days, it is important to stress an important history of Haile Selassie's life. Now, we talked about the second Italian invasion of Italy, I think in 1936. Now, Haile Selassie tried to forestall this invasion, to stop them in their ranks, and he was losing on the battleground. He went to his prayer, and he came back home after his fasting and prayers, and there was a crunch meeting that happened with the nobility, among the royalty leadership. And the thought was that how should they approach the war? Should they allow Addis Ababa to be conquered? And should their king be allowed to be taken? At the end of the discussion, they came to the agreement that Addis Ababa cannot be conquered with their king in there, and therefore Haile Selassie and his immediate family should immediately leave to protect the royalty. This decision became a very big thorn in the flesh of Haile Selassie, because some people like Marcus Garvey and some Ethiopians even to today say that he actually abandoned his people in the most difficult time. But he moved on from there. He went to Jerusalem because of his said Solomonic roots, and from there he went to the UK. He went to the to the League of Nations and made a phenomenal statement, which to today is mentioned as part of the most important speeches that changed the 20th century or modern history of Africa. So this is a very important thing. Now, his final days. In February 1974, 4 days of serious riots in Addis Ababa against a sudden economic inflation left 5 dead. But that was just the beginning of many things to happen. The emperor responded by announcing on national television he was going to reduce prices, and he actually did. And therefore, the people calmed down a little bit. But again, the military mutinied, and he promised them a 33% increase in their also their wages. The mutiny was happening in Asmara, at that time part of Ethiopia, now today capital of Eritrea. And this mutiny actually went on and spread across the country. It led to the resignation of his prime minister at that time, Aklilu Habte Wold, on 27 February 1974. Haile Selassie again went on television to agree with the military's demand to give them higher salary and named another man, Endekauchu Mekanon, as the new prime minister, despite Endekauchu's many concessions. Discontent continued to march on with 4 days general strike that paralyzed the nation. A group of young men in the military called the DEJ, formed a committee called the DEJ, low-ranking military people, and they set up in June to investigate the military's demand. They took advantage of the government disarray to depose many of the royalties. Now what happened? General Aman Michael Andon, a Protestant of Eritrean origin, served briefly as a provisional head of state pending the return of Crown Prince Asfa Ozen, who was then receiving medical treatment abroad. Selassie was replaced and was placed under house arrest at this time after the Dutch had managed to remove in pieces all the rulers, the governors, the parliament people. Now they placed him under house arrest. And briefly at the 4th Army Division of Addis Ababa, while most of his family was detained at the late Duke of Hara's residence in the north of the capital. The last months of Emperor's life were spent actually in imprisonment. But before we continue with this, it is important to mention that Haile Selassie, after the war, came back with Italy. He went to Britain. The British came, helped to remove the Italians. He came back and he actually continued to rule. But then the death came because of the many challenges, also primarily coming from the famine that is said he didn't pay attention to, and the people complained and complained. The Dutch put him under house arrest. And he spent the rest of his life in imprisonment. Reportedly, his mental condition was such that he believed he was still emperor of Ethiopia. Later, most of the imperial family was imprisoned at Addis Ababa, prison of Kechele, also known as Alem Bekagne, or in English means I've had enough of this world. On 23rd November, 60 former high officials of the imperial government were executed by firing squad without trial, which included Selassie's grandson, Iskender Desta, a rear admiral, and 2 former prime ministers. These killings, known to Ethiopians today as Bloody Saturday, were condemned by Crown Prince Asfa Ozen. The Dutch responded to his rebuke by revoking his acknowledgement of his imperial legitimacy and announcing the end of the Solomonic dynasty. Haile Selassie, who therefore became the last emperor of Ethiopia, died on 27th August of respiratory failure, following complications from a prostate examination followed up by a prostate operation. This state was later rejected, or a statement was rejected in 1994, which is almost 20 years after his death. An Ethiopian documents court actually found several former military officers guilty of strangling the Ethiopian emperor in his bed in 1975. Documents have been widely circulated online showing the Deji's final assassination order and bearing the military regime seal and signature. The veracity of these documents has been corroborated by multiple former members of the military Deji. The Soviet-backed PDRE fell in 1991, which was helping the Dutch to rule. In 1992, Selassie's bones were found under the concrete slab on the palace ground, though some reports suggest that his remains were discovered beneath a latrine. Selassie's coffin rested in Bahata, church for nearly a decade near his great uncle Menelik II's resting place. On 5th November 2000, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church gave him a funeral, but the government refused calls to declare the ceremony an official imperial funeral. Prominent Rastafari figures such as Rita Marley participated in the funeral, but most Rastafaris rejected the event and refused to accept that the bones were the remains of Selassie. They mean that his bones were not found, like Jesus. There is some debate within the Rastafari movement whether he actually died in 1975. Such was the tragic end of this man. Now, to conclude, let us understand some of the lessons we can pick from his life and bring all the pieces together. One must understand his place in life and know our context. Clearly, Haile Selassie understood his background and what it means for him personally. What it means for him personally. He did not just believe that the generations have come just because of a union between Solomon and Sheba, but he actually positioned himself in that context and began to live it. That at old age, at over 80, when the dead actually accosted him on 12 September 1974, they read out a proclamation to his dethronement to him. His response was, "If the revolution is good for the people, then me too, I support it," and would not oppose it. He was a man of extreme confidence in his roots, and it led him on to global prominence. And this is something each and every one of us must be conscious of. Now, 2, one must bid his time and patiently wait for his time working. The movement that deposed Iyasu, that is the king who was there before Zaiditu, and then Selassie came, preferred Tefari, actually, because he helped them to remove them, as he attracted support from both progressives and conservative factions. However, many of royalty and in the government believe that his usefulness makes him susceptible to external influence, and therefore, on 11th February 1917, Zaiditu was coronated and she pledged to rule justly through her regent Tefari. So while Rastafari was more visible of the two, Zaiditu really ruled and she put herself in the right place as an empress. While at this time Rastafari was helping the empress as a regent to rule the land, he was focusing on his work and was not necessarily orchestrating to overthrow the queen. His focus on his work endeared him more to the people, that it became obvious that he will rule the people. And so time matters, but what we do in time matters, because when the time comes for one's elevation, one must surely have bid his time and not gone ahead of time. 3, global thinking and acting will bring you to the global stage. Haile Selassie engaged global leaders and traveled extensively. He joined the League of Nations, brought Africa to Addis Ababa. Also, in keeping with his principles of collective security, he fought in the Korean War. He had fully approved and assured Ethiopians' participation in the UN-approved collective security operations in not just Korea, but also in Congo. He was so much of a global thinker that he was in support of the Vietnam War and supported in troops. He also remained open toward the United States and commended it for making progress with African American civil rights legislations in the 1950s and 1960s, while visiting the US several times during those years. He was not just minding his business in Ethiopia, but he was looking for a worldwide impact. Outside of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie continued to enjoy enormous prestige. Therefore, and he met up with JFK, Charles de Gaulle, in 1971, for instance, a non-aligned movement. He was there as one of the leaders who started it. He visited Italy as a guest of President Giuseppe Saragat, and in Milan he met Giordano Del Maro, president of Italy's Savings Bank Association. He visited China in October 1971 and was the first foreign head of state to meet Mao Zedong following the death of Mao's designated successor Lin Biao in a plane crash in Mongolia. So such was his level of affluence, but it is because he thought that he was the right guy to place Ethiopia and Africa and himself at the right place. 4. Be fearless. He faced many challenges as a regent and as an emperor. And for instance, in 1935 October, Haile Selassie gave more precise orders for his army to his commander-in-chief Ras Kassa at the height of the Ethiopian-Italian conflict. And he says, when you set up tents, it is to be in caves and by trees and in a wood. If the place happens to be adjoining to these and separate in the various platoons, tents are to be set up at a distance of 30 cubits from each other. He gave such direct instructions to his commanders, and he fought fearlessly against the Ethiopians. Haile Selassie in 1934, during the war, we talked about it. He went, he had prayers, and he had to leave. That is something that people also used to say, that he was not really a fighter to the end. But at least he stood in all the challenges, and he fought with his people in early days till his time of emperorship. Now 5, think long-term, think strategic, act with conviction. What do we learn from this man? During the Second War with Italy, again on March 31st, 1936, he launched a counterattack against the Italians himself. After the stormy session of the Council State, as I mentioned, it was agreed that because Addis Ababa could not be defeated, the governor would relocate to the southern town of Gori, and that in the interest of preserving the imperial house, the emperor's wife, Menen Asfau, and the rest of the imperial family should immediately depart for French Somaliland, and from them all continue to Jerusalem. This decision was not unanimous, and several participants, including noblemen Blatter, Tekle, Woodley, Hawariat, strenuously objected to the idea of an Ethiopian monarch fleeing before an invading force. While Haile Selassie appointed his cousin Ras Imru Haile Selassie as the prince regent in his absence, departing with his family, he moved on to Jerusalem, and then he spent the time in Britain. The choice of Jerusalem was highly symbolic, as we've said. But this is the most important time of his life, and it can be interpreted in many ways, but among those ways was that the people at that time, including him, thought of the long-term impact of the war and not just the winning the war at that season. And in many ways, he's being preserved, and going to the League of Nations and speaking, and the 10 of events, including the Second World War, made sure that he became also influential in bringing Ethiopia out of the hands of Italy. And that proved that thought of thinking and conviction helped him and the nation. 6, right communications make a difference. Now, Haile Selassie used crisp communication to improve his brand and to win the hearts of many. At the League of Nations, after fleeing from the Italians, Haile Selassie, after some heckling, waited calmly and made a speech that is known to be among the most stirring of the 20th century speeches ever. He said, noting that his own small people of 12 million inhabitants without resources could never withstand an attack of a large power such as Italy with its 42 million people and unlimited quantities of most death-dealing weapons. He contended that all small states were threatened by the aggression, that all small states were in effect reduced to vassal states in the absence of collective action. He admonished the League that God and history would remember their judgment. He said that today it is us, tomorrow it will be you. And that speech is something that Muammar Gaddafi also used, that phrase, during the time that US invaded Iraq and Saddam Hussein was killed. Muammar Gaddafi also went to the African nation and said, today Saddam Hussein, tomorrow it will be one of us. And unfortunately, tomorrow it was Gaddafi himself. But Haile Selassie's speech has riveted throughout the ages. And it is said that it is because of the League of Nations inaction in Ethiopia, among a few others, that also brought the demise of the League of Nations. This speech made him an icon for anti-fascist movements around the world, and the Times named him Man of the Year by proper communication or effective communication. Also in 1937, Selassie was made a very impactful Christmas Day radio address to the American people on radio, and in this he linked Christianity and goodwill with the covenant of the League of Nations and asserted that war is not the only means to stop war. And this is the time that the likes of Martin Luther King would also be impacted greatly. Again, in 5th May 1941, Haile Selassie actually re-entered Addis Ababa and personally addressed the Ethiopian people 5 years to the day before, to the day since he left 1936 exile. He declared, "Today is the day on which we defeated our enemies. Therefore, when we say, let us rejoice with our hearts, let not our rejoicing be in any other way but in the spirit of Christ. Do not return evil for evil. Do not indulge in the atrocities which the enemy has been practicing in his usual way, even to the last." And it moved the people. Again, on October 4th, 1963, Haile Selassie addressed the General Assembly of the United Nations, where he eloquently referred to his address to his earlier speech to the League of Nations. 7. So, effective communication makes a difference, and those who have known how to speak have moved mentality, moved people, and caused a lot of change in this world. Now, 7, be a reader and a writer to impact generations. Haile Selassie spent his exile years 1966 to 1941 in Bath, England, in Fairfield House, which he bought. The Emperor and Kasa Haile Dage took morning walks together behind his high walls in Victoria House. Selassie's favorite reading was diplomatic history, but most of his serious hours were occupied with the 90,000 word story of his life that he was laboriously writing in Amharic. He spent the time to read and to write. Now, after he was ousted by the subsequently infamous Major Mengistus Mariam in 1974, Haile Selassie spent the last months of his life imprisoned in rooms in the Ground Palace. He continued to get up at dawn, attending morning mass, and spending most of his time reading, demonstrating one of his key sources of ideas and brilliance that endeared him to the world. He never stopped reading. He never said he's from the roots of Solomon, and therefore people should know about him. He was a reader, and therefore he was able to impact the world. Therefore, readers are leaders, as has been said, and we should endeavor to read and to be able to lead. 8, refresh and keep your focus. Focus matters, but Emperor Selassie seemed to have lost it. His servants kept prompting him up. There was a season later on in his life that he was, as he comes, everybody bows down. Nobody could tell him the right thing. He was just following, people were just following through. He was really, really on his own. And he had not built his people to be able to really speak to him the truth, but people would come and be telling him rumors that they are hearing and about him and about the kingdom. He appeared to have lost his focus on his people and only and seeing his brand and his status rise in the global realm, whilst his own environment or his people or his nation were changing. Haile Selassie also seemed to enjoy the new religion which raised him, and in his name that was coming up. The Rastafari movement and all of that had eaten up his mind. He refused to directly declare to his followers that he is not a savior. This resulted in student groups, and many groups begin to demonstrate against him. The loss of focus. Yes, he had a prince that should reign, but they looked up to him, and he was absent now in the life of his people. A famine came, and apparently it took a long time. He didn't even visit the place, and when he went, he said, this is one of the acts of God that one cannot do much about or do anything about. And student groups rose up, military rose up, and all of that resulted in the death. That young group dismantling the chieftaincy and the entire rulership that brought him down. So fame is not all of it. Personal pride is not all of it. If you transform without the full transformation and the ongoing accompaniment of your people, you lose it. This is one of the reasons why in the CAA we are not bringing up people who are looking for only self-interest, but the advancement of Africa. Haile Selassie was a man who had great impact and had great opportunities, but unfortunately became the last emperor of Ethiopia because his personality became higher than himself and his people. May we not get to that stage, and may these lessons guide us and lead us. Thank you very much. We believe you've learned something. We believe that these lessons will impact you, and by God's grace, it will raise many powerful Africans who would shape up the continent to the glory of God and to the advancement of Africa. Thank you very much, and we look forward to our next meeting in October 19th, same venue, and we are going to go through part 3 of this series. I am enjoying it. I'm learning so much. I'm being shaped up, and all of these things will come together. Will come together in what God will do with us and for us in Africa and as Africans. Please make it a point to be there. Make it a point to join us. Invite others. Yes, many wonderful things are happening. God is using us to do great things. 19th October, we'll see you. Have a wonderful time. Enjoy your weekend, and may you end the 9th month of 2019 bringing forth every blessings that you have been pregnant with. May we hear good news the next time we meet. Have a lovely time. Thank you. Bye.